The Intel Arc A750 is certainly an interesting, yet largely unaccounted for graphics card that's held my interest for the past year or two. And while I also have its bigger, more beefy brother, the Arc A770 16GB, I find myself coming back to the A750 time and again because of how the card is priced. Strap in because it's going to be an interesting ride to say the least. The A750, like any other Intel graphics card, has some weaknesses and considerable strengths that show quite noticeably in some areas but may not come into play in others. This inconsistency is what ultimately makes blindly recommending this hardware tough to do, because you go from running excellently on some titles like Red Dead 2 and Apex Legends, along with productivity software like DaVinci Resolve, to getting GTX 1070 or 1080 levels of performance in some games built on older but still very popular rendering APIs like DirectX 9 and 11, and some older OpenGL versions. The obvious solution to this is to just play more modern or better optimized games, but should this really be the solution for your everyday consumer? Probably not, and it's because of this that I can see why your quote-unquote normie PC users, for lack of a better term, stick to primarily Nvidia and maybe AMD if they're more experienced. But if you're looking at one of these cards, how can you expect it to perform? To put the A750 through its paces, let's throw it into my test system, an i7-14700K based Z690 build with 64 gigs of 3600 megatransfer per second DDR4 and 4 NVMe SSDs to store our OS and games. These large and quick secondary storage and memory pools will help to keep the GPU and CPU fed with data, and prevent any sort of stuttering caused by these processing support systems. A full spec list and target clocks are in the description should you wish to replicate any of these tests on your own. Additionally, if there were any special options used during a test, I'll make it known. Specifically XDefiant, I ended up turning the E-cores off on the 14700K because the game just doesn't schedule things properly when the two core types are on. Without anything else to say, let's dive into the A750 and see how the card is performing at this point in time. Apex Legends is usually where we start on this channel, and from what the A750 achieved, it's really hard to complain. But there are some areas where I'd still tune things. Returning an average and 1% low of 189 and 117 FPS at 1080p, the A750 can chew through this game at the maximum settings at basically the same performance level that it could at low on DirectX 11. Now that Apex has a DirectX 12 backend that you can switch to, the game's performance might not look significantly better than older benchmarks, but from actually playing it, it feels so much smoother and consistent. 1440p came down to an average of 139 and a 1% low of 106, which is still playable and felt great to play. Even 4K, which returned an average and 1% low of 90 and 67 FPS, was beyond playable on a 60Hz screen in all situations. This game's migration over to DirectX 12 really seems to have helped the A750 push more frames more consistently, especially at lower resolutions with higher graphics settings. I might look at an A750 if I wanted to get into Apex Legends on a 1080p high refresh rate monitor. But even 1440p and 4K were decent experiences, which is a nice change of pace. Up next is our last video's contender, Black Ops 6, and this time with the 14700K, the performance returned by the A750 didn't improve by much. With an average and 1% low of 183 FPS at the basic preset at 1080p, this is playable for sure, but may not fully scratch a high refresh rate itch that the RX 6600 would probably be able to support in this scenario. Jumping up to 1440p, and the average came down to 86, with the 1% lows coming in at 69. Once again being playable but not really excelling. 4K returned the most console-level performance that we've seen on this card up until this point, with the average coming in at 60 and the 1% low at 49, showing that the card really hung out below the average most of the time. ZSS didn't really help the averages or 1% lows much, which is kind of a head-scratcher considering the A750 can accelerate ZSS using the XMX cores. Either way, you'd probably want to leave ZSS off to keep your game looking clearer, and at the performance levels achieved here, it's hard to say that it's really where I'd want to play this game, but it's also hard to say that it's performing exceptionally poorly. The next game in our test suite is the DirectX 11 Classic Counter-Strike 2. which I can confidently say is both GPU bottlenecked and underperforming when compared to price competitors from AMD. Achieving an average in 1% low of 209 and 92 FPS, this game runs fine in 98% of gameplay situations, and usually drops frames during those kill frame zooms that happen after you die. The fact that they happen is kind of questionable, but at the same time it happens on every other system, just not to the same degree. 1440p saw the card retain a decent amount of performance, coming in at 176 FPS on average and 88 FPS for the 1% low. The A750 doesn't lose as much performance when making the jump up to 1440p, only coming in at around a 16% loss for a rough doubling of the pixel count. Making the move up to 4K and the performance starts to take a hit, with the average coming in at 108 and the 1% low at 74. This is still playable, but for some ultra-competitive gamers it's not optimal. The performance trend on the A750 makes me want to lean towards sticking to 1440p as the sweet spot in terms of pixel count and performance. But if you want to squeeze every last frame from the thing, then 1080p would work well too. Cyberbug 2077, another DirectX 12 title that's well known for being rather demanding on both the CPU and GPU, returned playable performance at 1080p but started to get more questionable once the resolution jumped up to 1440p and beyond. Achieving an average and 1% low of 89 and 69 FPS, the A750 was able to play this game relatively smoothly and without massive hitches. 1440p, even though the 1% low came in at 49 FPS, the average of 61 kind of saved things, even though the real-time performance generally hung out below 60 FPS the majority of the time. 4K could run on this card, but the average frame rate of 35 kind of hints that it's more of a console-level experience. Realistically, you could lower some of the settings and enable ZSS if you're hellbent on playing at 4K, but if you're fine with 1080p, then the A750 provides a great experience, and would let you play through this game without issue. Ray and path tracing are probably off the table as this card only sports 28 ray tracing cores, but the fact that you can turn it on is more a triumph of the PC platform than it is a detriment on this configuration. Fortnite, also tested at the medium preset with TAA enabled and ray tracing turned off, returned competitive frame rates at all resolutions tested, though there is some still odd behavior surrounding the 1% lows. At 1080p, the card achieved an average of 143 FPS and a 1% low of 74, which is behind the 1% low achieved at 1440p. This can be explained away as a landing stutter, which happens in almost every battle royale game. This worst case scenario didn't happen during regular gameplay, so by and large everything was subjectively very smooth on this card, which is an improvement over the somewhat questionable frame pacing that the card had in this title when it first released. Jumping up to 1440p, and the average came down to 121 FPS and the 1% low jumped up to 96, in the end running better at the lower end of things than at lower resolutions. 4K didn't continue this trend, instead dropping both the average and 1% low down to 71 and 56 FPS respectively. Would I play Fortnite on this card casually? Well, it's hard to say no if you're going to be playing at 1080 or 1440p, but if you're wanting the absolute most frames per second, then a competing RTX 3060 12GB would slightly outperform the A750 that we've got here. Up next is just one of those games that runs poorly on almost all PC hardware, except for higher end cards from Nvidia and AMD. Helldivers 2, once again another popular game built on a DirectX 12 backend, was technically playable, but really not optimal in any sense of the word. We're playing at the low preset, which admittedly doesn't look horrible in terms of texture quality and the number of effects going on at once, but it runs so slowly that I'm genuinely questioning if I've been misconfiguring something on every test that I've run on it. My prior Helldivers 2 on the A750 video saw performance that wasn't much better than what's being achieved this time around, so at least it's somewhat consistent, but it's just not great. Returning an average and 1% low of 78 and 52 FPS at 1080p, the A750 will be running perfectly fine and then drop dramatically depending on the weather effects that dynamically play during gameplay. Specifically, the snow and rain makes the performance drop a lot when either using an A750 or A770, so it's probably just some inefficiency with the Intel driver, but the other effects like the dense volumetric fog honestly look great and don't bog down your hardware that much. 1440p remained somewhat playable, returning an average of 64 and a 1% low of 46, and 4K was just not responsive enough to be that enjoyable. The average of 43 FPS isn't horrible, but the 1% low of 32 was really noticeable and got me killed a time or two when dealing with a large horde of enemies. No matter how you slice it, I wouldn't pick up an A750 just to get into Helldivers, but if you play the game occasionally, it can run it, but really not that well. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, another classic battle royale game built on DirectX 12 in this test, I'm pretty happy to say that this game is playable at all resolutions, though 1440 and 1080p are obviously much smoother if you're using a high refresh rate monitor. Starting off at 1080p, and the A750 returned an average and 1% low of 180 and 91 FPS respectively. This is great for a 180Hz 1080p display that I've got, but anything beyond that you won't see much of an improvement. Chances are if your monitor supports beyond 180Hz, it has some form of variable refresh rate tech like FreeSync, which would pair beautifully with this card in this game. Jumping up to 1440p, and things came down to a still very playable 144 FPS average with a 95 FPS 1% low. Like Fortnite, this game displayed more landing stutters when the card was running at 1080p, possibly because the system was more CPU bound, thus causing more inconsistencies in frame times. This also happened during the intro drop-in sequence, and didn't happen during regular gameplay, meaning that things felt smooth when they needed to. 4K was still playable on a 4K 60Hz screen, coming in with an 82 FPS average and a 67 FPS 1% low. Like most esport games on this card, it seems like 1440 and 1080p are going to be where you'll want to spend most of your time. But the fact that it can run 4K at this performance level is a nice to have if you're rocking a higher resolution monitor. One of the more impressive games in terms of the quality of pixels on display, despite their technically console level quality settings, is Red Dead Redemption 2. This game makes me very excited for what GTA 6 will offer when it comes out, especially on PC, because this game is truly a state-of-the-art graphical showcase even 6 years after release. At 1080p, the A750 returned an average and 1% low of 116 and 82 FPS, which doesn't sound super impressive, but when you're playing the game for yourself, it looks amazing and feels great to use a mouse on. 1440p kept the same butter smooth feel despite not offering the maximum frame rates when compared to the RX 6600. With an average of 91 FPS and a 1% low of 69, the A750 provides performance that I don't really have a problem with, despite comparisons making this card seem like it's falling behind. Even 4K felt very playable, returning an average of only 55 and the 1% low coming in at 44. Would I prefer to play at 1440 or 1080p? Well, yeah, it just feels and looks superior on almost any display, but it's also hard to complain considering the RX 6600 would actually fall behind at 4K. Red Dead 2 seems to just be one of those once-in-a-generation games that makes people still question how they pulled these effects off. And the fact that the A750 can run it without much complaint is a testament to both the hardware and software we're running here. The last game, well, it won't really matter in a couple months because you can't even download it anymore, but I ended up following some advice I got on my most recent 9700K video. For testing XDefiant, I ended up turning off the E-cores on the 14700K, forcing the game to run only on the P-cores, and doing so caused the average performance to jump up by about 10% depending on the resolution, but the 1% lows actually got worse for some reason. I'm deciding to only discuss the performance figures collected without the E-cores turned on, because if you're wanting the most performance on a system like this, you'll probably have turned the extra cores off a while ago. At 1080p, the A750 returned an average of 147 and a 1% low of 76. For a Call of Duty-esque game, this performance is ultimately fine and doesn't leave me feeling non-competitive. Even jumping up to 1440p saw the card achieve an average and 1% low of 112 and 64 FPS, which remains competitive, but there are some hitches that show up in the performance telemetry. I will say though that I didn't notice until I looked at the frame counter. Even 4K remained playable, but probably not where most would want to play at to remain highly competitive. With the average and 1% low coming in at 71 and 48 FPS, even 4K remained playable, but probably not where most would want to play at to remain highly competitive, with the average and 1% low coming in at 71 and 48 FPS. Would I personally play at 4K? Potentially, but I would definitely have to tune some of the settings or turn on a resolution scaling feature, because hard dips into the high 40s felt chunky even on a 60Hz display. Like most games tested, 1440 and 1080p are probably where I'd spend most of my time in this game, with 1440p offering a nice middle ground in terms of pixel count and performance. I had a whole couple paragraphs written discussing where this card falls in the old line of available cards. Fortunately for us in Intel, they actually released the Battle Mage-based Arc B580, which seems to be the rough price and performance level replacement for the A750. I'm still expecting at least one 7 tier of Battle Mage card to be released, but it's definitely sort of a good sign that the 5 series of Battle Mage card is replacing an old 7 tier card, in terms of performance of the upcoming 7 tier cards. As for if that card is worth checking out over the A750, it technically has more and much faster clocked RAM, larger total cache capacity, and it's generally able to keep up with the A750, plus or minus a few percent here and there, despite it having close to 30% fewer shading cores and significantly less tensor hardware. Keep in mind the B580 is also a PCIe Gen 4x8 design, meaning it will lose performance in PCIe Gen 3 based system. Would I buy the A750 over the B580? Honestly, considering where the Battle Mage card sits, the A750 is probably the stronger choice considering it's about 50 to 60 USD cheaper, comes with a full Gen 4x16 PCIe connection, and the RAM is technically faster in terms of total transfer speeds even though it doesn't have the capacity advantage. As for if the card is worth considering when compared to what's available from the red and green teams, this card is cheaper but it's outperformed by its direct competitors such as the RX 6600, which is now the slightly faster RX 7600, and the RTX 3050 and 3060, which is now the RTX 4060. The overall landscape this past year hasn't changed much in terms of where this particular graphics card sits in comparison to the competition, but now that things are starting to heat up in the GPU space again, with the RTX 5000 series and RX 8000 series on the horizon, it might be worth waiting if you have the ability to, just to see how fast, cheap, and available the newer cards, specifically from AMD, will be. And with how Battle Mage is going, there might be an interesting direct A750 replacement in the pipeline. The A750 is definitely an interesting card from a technical perspective, but it still sort of lacks the ability to actually make use of all this interesting hardware. I sadly don't really think that we'll see many more Alchemist targeted performance tweaks in the drivers, as Intel is probably moving the majority of their graphics team to start working on Battle Mage. It's a shame, but this card is definitely going to hold a special place in my heart, considering I've gotten over 2 years of interested knowledge from the thing. It's something that I won't forget, and I can only hope that these cards have also inspired someone else out there other than me. So, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. I didn't want to end this video on that kind of a note, but with how Intel is going as a company, I can really see them pushing Battle Mage and putting Alchemist to the side, even though I really hope that that doesn't play out the way that I'm worried it might. That's all I really have to say on the matter. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.